The year 2021, which began with hope for the best after the turbulent 2020, brought with it not only problems and worries, but also several real stories that make the blood run cold. Local newspapers and blogs were filled with stories that went beyond the usual urban legends and tales. These stories took place in small towns and even in megacities, where the hustle and bustle could not hide the horror that suddenly burst into people's lives. One of these stories began in the tiny town of Gravesville, which was famous for its old, dilapidated bridge spanning a ravine overgrown with a river. The bridge was built in the early 1900s and has witnessed many tragedies, from accidental drownings to more sinister incidents that were whispered about only in kitchens by candlelight. The locals knew that crossing this bridge alone at night was a bad idea. The elderly Mrs. Hutcher, who is already 83 years old, loved to tell her neighbors and grandchildren how their uncle disappeared one day in her childhood, who decided to cross the bridge on Halloween night. "All that's left of him is a hat embedded in rotten wood," she whispered, as if it were a secret that could attract trouble if spoken too loudly. In the spring of 2021, at the moment when the first mists began to swirl over the river and creep along the slopes of the ravine, a group of young people decided to test their courage and cross the bridge at midnight. Among them was Jenny, a local history teacher known for her love of mysticism and old legends. She gathered her company, including her childhood friend Luke, who had just returned from the army, and two colleagues, Rachel and Tom. They stood at the beginning of the bridge, illuminated only by the light of telephones, and laughed at old stories. But the silence around them, broken only by the occasional cawing of crows and the rustle of dry branches underfoot, suddenly made them freeze. The air itself seemed to have changed, becoming thick, as if the fog had absorbed sounds and moving life. "Who's the first one?" Luke grinned, but his voice sounded strained, as if he was trying to overcome an inner fear. Jenny took the first step, confidently placing her foot on the first plank of the bridge. Rotten wood crunched under her feet, as Thor, and she froze for a moment, listening to the dull creak. The others, encouraged by her determination, followed. The group slowly moved forward, each step echoing hollowly through the empty ravine. The cold wind whispered indistinct words, as if someone's voices were overlaid by the sounds of distant rustling. Jenny felt goosebumps running down her skin, but she kept her face calm, although her hands began to tremble a little. "Hey, do you hear that?" Rachel whispered, stopping and listening. She clutched the phone closer to her chest, illuminating only her own face, which made her cheeks paler and her eyes brighter. Tom shook his head with a grin. "It's just the wind. Are you really that scared?" But before Rachel could answer, the bridge beneath them creaked, as if the planks were starting to move on their own. Everyone froze. Their gazes darted down to where the black water was slowly flowing, absorbing any light. Luke took a step forward and heard the same crash again, but this time it came from the other side of the bridge, behind them. He turned abruptly and saw the shadows at the beginning of the bridge moving, as if someone was standing there watching them. But it couldn't be true. They had checked the road before the start. The shadows began to move and seemed to merge into one black silhouette. "Who's there?" Luke shouted, trying to keep calm, but there was a hint of panic in his voice. Instead of answering, there was a rustle from the darkness, resembling slow, heavy breathing. Jenny froze, her heart beating so fast that she thought it was going to jump out of her chest. The footsteps, barely audible, approached, and suddenly the lights of the phones began to blink, as if something was interfering with them. As the darkness deepened, the figure at the other end of the bridge stepped forward. It was a creature that was difficult to see because of the thick shadow and flashing light. It was as if it was part of a fog, with empty eyes that stared through them, burning their souls with fear. "Let's run!" Jenny shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and rushing forward. Rachel clung to Jenny's arm, barely able to keep her balance as the bridge shook under her feet, as if the old planks were alive and trying to throw them into the icy water below. Tom and Luke followed, their feet sliding on the wet boards, their hearts pounding in a rhythm of panic. There was a hoarse sound behind them, as if someone was scratching on the wooden surface with sharp claws. Luke turned as he ran and saw the fog thickening behind them, forming an eerie silhouette. He no longer resembled a man. It was something ancient, sinister, with vague outlines and glowing red eyes. Fear gripped him so tightly that his legs stopped moving for a moment and he almost fell. "Luke, hurry up," Jenny shouted, her voice shaking with tension. She had already reached the middle of the bridge, where the planks were particularly unreliable. Suddenly something clicked under her feet, and the wood cracked. With a scream, she fell through the hole with one foot, and only Rachel's strong grip kept her from falling. Luke rushed forward, feeling panic rising up his spine, making the blood pound in his temples. He grabbed Jenny's other arm, and together with Rachel, they pulled her back onto the bridge. Tom, who had stayed a little behind, turned at the sound of a strange whisper that seemed to come directly from the fog surrounding them. "It's not the wind," he said, his voice breaking into a hoarse whisper. "Whatever it is here." As soon as he said that, the figure took another step forward, and the darkness around them became almost tangible. It was as if something was pulling them deeper, slowing down every movement, making time stretch out. The creature's eyes flashed brighter, emitting a light that was colder than death itself. "Tom." Jenny was already on her feet, pulling at his arm, but he froze, unable to take his eyes off the sinister silhouette. His whole body tensed as if he was gripped by terror. Tom froze, as if paralyzed. Jenny felt an icy fear squeeze her heart as she realized that Tom's gaze was blank and motionless. She knew that if they didn't get him out now, he would be the next one to be taken away by this unknown evil. "Tom, wake up!" Luke shouted, yanking him by the shoulder. But instead of turning around, Tom began to walk slowly backwards, as if he was being pulled by an invisible force. Rachel gave a strangled cry, feeling her voice break into hysterical notes. The wind picked up, howling and filling the air with hoarse voices repeating unintelligible, creepy phrases. It was as if the bridge had come to life and wanted to take them all away. "We can't leave him." Jenny tried to take a step back, but Luke, gritting his teeth, grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. He knew that staying here was a fatal mistake. "Run, Jenny. Run now. Stop it," he yelled, and despair flashed in his eyes as he looked at Tom. But Tom was already out of reach. His face twisted into a grimace of horror as he slowly disappeared into the misty curtain, and his scream echoed through the ravine before ending. Luke, Jenny, and Rachel ran, stumbling and falling, until they finally reached the end of the bridge. The final groan of the old boards sounded behind them, and silence swallowed them up, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the hollow beating of their own hearts. They turned around, but the fog was already clearing, leaving no trace of Tom or whatever had taken him. There was a long, suffocating silence. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. All three of them stood panting, unable to believe what they had just been through. Jenny felt her legs give way, and she sank to the ground, covering her face with her hands. It seemed to her that if she took her hands away, she would see this nightmare again, which was perhaps too real to just forget. Luke took a few steps back, glancing at the bridge, which now seemed completely ordinary, as if nothing had happened. But his heart told him the opposite. It was impossible to rationalize what had happened. He looked at Rachel, who was silently clenching her hands into fists, trying to keep from trembling. "We need to get back," Luke finally said, his voice sounding hollow and tired. "We have to tell you about it. Tell me what happened to Tom." Rachel looked up sharply, her eyes full of tears. "What are we going to say? Who will believe us? They'll say we're crazy or that it was some kind of joke." Jenny slowly looked up. She knew Rachel was right. Local authorities are already used to writing off any rumors about the bridge as simple urban tales. But they knew the truth. They knew that no one else should come here. "We have to warn the others," she said quietly. "Even if they don't believe us, we have to try." They began to return to the city, walking silently along the road, where the light of the lanterns dispersed the remnants of the nightmare. Thousands of unanswered questions were spinning in everyone's heads. What was that? Why did Tom become his victim? Was it something that could be stopped, or were they just faced with an unknown horror that they were powerless to face? Already at dawn, when the first rays of the sun began to turn the sky pale pink, they reached the borders of the city. It was quiet outside, except for the early birds chirping in the treetops, as if nothing had happened. It seemed that this city lived by its own rules, not recognizing the nightmares that roamed its outskirts. Luke was the first to cross the threshold of the police station. The room smelled of old coffee and paper, and faded photographs of former sheriffs of the city hung on the walls. The duty officer looked up, looking at them with obvious surprise. His name was Sheriff Baker, and he knew everyone in town. He noticed their exhausted faces and tense movements and immediately realized that something serious had happened. What happened? His voice sounded wary as he stood up and walked over to them. Jenny looked at the sheriff and took a deep breath to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Rachel, trembling, sank into the nearest chair, and Luke, unable to stand the tension, said, "Tom is missing. The bridge?" He couldn't finish the sentence, but the sheriff understood him without words. Sheriff Baker frowned and nodded, motioning for them to sit down. His face remained calm, although there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He had heard stories about the bridge, heard stories and old legends, but he had never taken them seriously. But now there were 3 people standing in front of him, clearly shocked and saying the same thing. Something on the bridge had taken their friend. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said firmly, and his voice sounded as if he was preparing to accept the unpleasant truth. Jenny started talking. Her voice was low, trembling, but with every word she gathered courage, telling about how they went to the bridge at night, about strange sounds, about a shadow that seemed alive. She described in detail the last moments when Tom stopped moving and disappeared into the fog. The sheriff listened attentively, without interrupting. His gaze became more and more intense. When Jenny stopped talking, there was a pause, and only the old clock on the wall ticked off the slow seconds. "We have to go there," he finally said, looking at his colleagues, who were listening with interest to the story. Luke shook his head. "No, it's too dangerous. We have already seen that this bridge is not what it seems." The sheriff pursed his lips, then sighed, realizing that the people in front of him were scared to the core. But duty demanded action. Sheriff Baker understood that he was obliged to check all the circumstances, despite their fears and the absurdity of what he had heard. He called a couple of experienced officers and went with them to the bridge. Jenny, Luke, and Rachel did not resist. They just watched as the patrol car with red and blue flashing lights disappeared around the bend. They were sitting on a bench by the police station, silent and devastated. Fragments of memories were playing in Jenny's head, and the sound of breaking boards was still in her ears. Rachel looked lost, and Luke clenched his fists from time to time, trying to find a way to calm his shaking hands. An hour later, the sheriff returned, but there was no confidence in his eyes. They found no trace of Tom, only damaged boards and the remains of their own footprints. The fog lifted, revealing the empty and calm surface of the water under the bridge. The sheriff sat down next to them, taking off his hat and wiping sweat from his forehead. "But we will start a search operation and explore the river and forests. We will do our best to find your friend." But inside, Jenny knew they wouldn't find Tom. They'll never know what happened that night. Perhaps the bridge was old, the planks were rotting and could collapse under any weight. Perhaps Tom lost his balance in a panic and fell into the river, and the current carried away his body. There were many explanations, but they all seemed empty compared to the horror they had endured. Weeks passed, and the search for Tom gradually faded away. The city returned to its usual life, and the incident became another story that was remembered in whispers when discussing the bridge on the outskirts. Jenny, Rachel, and Luke never went there again. They understood that some places are better left alone, even if the mind finds an explanation. But the heart does not. Time passed, but every time Jenny walked past the station, she noticed Sheriff Baker's gaze, a look in which something incomprehensible flickered, as if he, too, began to believe that everything in the city was not as simple as it seemed.